Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. Thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Phoebe Potter. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and I will be moderating the discussion today. I want to thank you all for being on this webinar, and also thank our partners at the Bureau of Justice Assistance for participating in the presentation as well. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housecleaning items about how the webinar is going to work. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the QA panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to help you with those technical questions as soon as we can. For the content-related questions, we're going to keep a running list and address them all at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many of those questions as possible and follow up with you on those that we don't get to. If you encounter any technical or audio problems during the webinar, please call the WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording this event, and we will post it on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week. Once it has been posted, we will email you a link to the recording. I'll now introduce the speakers for our presentation today. We are joined by Dr. Gary Dennis, Senior Policy Advisor for Corrections at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice, to discuss BJA's goals and expectations for this grant. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues at the Justice Center who will be discussing how we can support you over the life of your grant. Mike Eisenberg is a research manager with the Justice Center and will support all data-related activities you will be undertaking with these grants. And Dr. Shanique Thomas is a policy analyst who will be working with some of you directly as a lead technical assistance provider. We're going to kick off the webinar with some introductions so that you all know who we are, as well as who your fellow grantees are. We will then provide an overview of the statewide recidivism reduction program and expectations for the planning process. We will then spend the bulk of the time walking you through the planning and implementation guide, which is the primary deliverable for this grant, to discuss expectations, how you can complete the guide, and the supports that are available to help you do so. You should have all received a copy of the guide, but if you have not, you can access the PDF at the link which will be entered into the chat box below on the right-hand side of your screen. We can also follow up and provide you with a Word version of this document after the webinar if you need it. Before handing the presentation over to Dr. Dennis, I do want to give you a bit more background on the Justice Center and the National Reentry Resource Center. The Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. Staff provide practical, nonpartisan advice and evidence-based, consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. This slide shows a snapshot of the Justice Center website homepage. By clicking through the Reentry portal, you can access the National Reentry Resource Center website. Technical assistance for your Second Chance Act grant is provided by the National Reentry Resource Center. The NRRC is funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and provides support to Second Chance Act grantees in the broader field. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the link on your screen after today's webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dennis to speak about the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Second Chance Act, and the statewide recidivism reduction program specifically.
Thanks very much, Phoebe. Can you hear me all right?
You sound good.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to participate in the webinar. I just got back from a hearing over on Capitol Hill on the Senate side where several of our champions who have been the bipartisan and bicameral sponsors of the original Second Chance Act announced that they are ready to introduce a reauthorization of the Second Chance Act. And so it's very exciting to have seen so many different groups in that room who have been supportive of the work of Second Chance. And certainly the Bureau of Justice Assistance, being part of the Office of Justice Programs within the Department of Justice, has had the privilege of being the lead federal agency And in the previous slide, you saw where we have awarded over 600 grants in the various sections of the Second Chance Act, over $300 million that the National Reentry Resource Center and Council of State Governments Justice Center is helping us to manage. And our mission is to provide leadership and services in grant administration and criminal justice policy development. And so our staff here, particularly the policy staff, have responsibility for drafting the solicitations and managing that process, helping to work with a contractor, Lockheed Martin, to make decisions based on a peer review process about who receives the awards. And then our program side are the ones that will help work with you on the technicalities of helping to manage your grant, the need to submit any grant adjustment notices or GANs. But as Steve pointed out, the staff of the Council of State Government Justice Centers will be the primary folks who will provide technical assistance to you as you move through the planning guide. So the Second Chance Act has many different sections, and for the first 4 years we concentrated with our flagship program, which was the reentry demonstration grants. But of course there were other programs like the programs for co-occurring disorders, programs that funded family-based treatment, programs that funded career technology. And we were looking at issues about how we could achieve statewide reductions in recidivism, simply because the folks over on the Hill were very much interested in that. Most of you are familiar with the Second Chance Act will remember that as it was originally drafted, it talked about a goal of a 50% reduction in recidivism over a 5-year period, amounting to 10% a year. Those of us who worked in the field for a while realized that that was a completely unrealistic expectation, to be able to have those kinds of reductions in recidivism over even a 5-year period. But we also felt like that we've made so much progress in the various states that it was not unrealistic to look at, in particular instances, being able to document a statewide reduction in recidivism. So this particular program, funded under the Second Chance Act, the Comprehensive Statewide Adult Recidivism Reduction Program, does that. It is a multi-year, multi-phased approach to create potential state centers of excellence that can serve as national models and develop strategies that other states can use. I want to congratulate the 13 awardees, and they're listed on the next slide: the Alaska Native Justice Center, Arkansas Department of Corrections, Georgia DOC, Illinois DOC, Executive Office of the State of Iowa, which is in essence the Iowa DOC, State of Kansas, State of Michigan, Minnesota, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Vermont, and West Virginia. Many of these states have been pioneers in second chance programming already, have achieved some significant results. Many of these states have worked with us in our Justice Reinvestment Initiative, as well as some other initiatives that we have actually worked in partnership with the National Institute of Corrections. This is the first time that the Department of Justice has done something like this. Our director, Denise O'Donnell, is very committed to it, and she refers to it as sort of a race to the top. So I congratulate these 13 jurisdictions, because you've sort of won the first leg of what might be termed the Triple Crown. The planning grant that you received, anywhere from $75,000 to $100,000, working with the intensive technical assistance consultants from the Council of State Governments, along with having to utilizing the planning guide, will help you to develop what we hope will be a competitive plan to reduce recidivism on a statewide level in your particular jurisdiction or state, starting with the ability to clearly and accurately document a baseline recidivism rate. So what's going to happen is probably sometime around mid-summer, we'll anticipate that those plans will be ready for submission here to the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We'll take a look at those, and we will probably pick, of the ones that are submitted, we'll probably pick 5 or 6 plans to request you to submit the full-blown plan. And then from those 5 or 6, we intend to zero in on the 2 or 3 what we consider to be best plans, most effective, that have the greatest chance of success and will get us the biggest bang for the buck. And based on our FY14 appropriations, which we anticipate will be at pretty much the same level now we then would be in a position to make awards to 2 or 3 of the 13 that have submitted the best plans in the neighborhood of somewhere between $2 and $4 million over a 2-year period to implement those plans. So again, this is just sort of the beginning of the race. I want to encourage you to listen very carefully to the technical assistance consultants from CSG and to work diligently to adhere to completing the planning guide, and then we'll look forward to talking with you as this process proceeds to see how it's coming along, and hopefully some of you all, well, not hopefully, obviously some 3 or 4 or 5 of the best will make the second cut, and then 2 or 3 of the best will get the large award at the end of the process. Phoebe, that's all I really need to say right now, but I know there may be some questions about the logistics of this from BJA's standpoint, so I'll stay on the line when you're finished and be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Dennis. And I'm going to walk through a little bit of that kind of timing and process over the next few slides. So, feel free to chime in, too, if you have anything to add while I do that. So the next leg of the presentation is just giving everyone on the call kind of an overview of the program and the planning process, which Dr. Dennis just kind of laid out pretty quickly for you all. So going back to the purpose of the program, as Dr. Dennis alluded to, the goal of this program was to develop a grant track specifically for state corrections agencies to really implement comprehensive strategies for reducing recidivism statewide. So not just small targeted pilot programs alone, but thinking more comprehensively about changing policy and practice and building capacity oriented around kind of 3 key areas that are really founded in the risk-need responsivity principles. So focusing on the offenders who are most likely to recidivate, using evidence-based programs and ensuring they're delivered in a high-quality way, and deploying effective supervision policies and practices that balance sanction and treatment to promote successful reentry in the community. There are 2 phases to this program. Again, so you all have been selected for this first phase around planning and capacity building. You're the 13 grantees that are expected to complete certain activities through the planning phase, including the P&I guide, which we'll be walking you through, to become eligible then for funding in phase 2. And as Dr. Dennis mentioned, there will be kind of a phased process in terms of selecting implementation sites, a competitive process. And it sounds like between 2 and 3 grantees will be selected pending appropriations for fiscal year 2014. So here's a little bit of the timeline that we have mapped out about how to complete this planning process and make sure that you have everything done in the timeline necessary to be ready to submit those implementation proposals when it's time to do so. As you can see, it's a little bit more condensed than a typical 1-year planning process, and so part of the reason that we want to connect with you as quickly as possible to make sure you have all the information you need and the support you need to go through this process. And so the goals are to make sure you have you have a comprehensive planning team in place with a clear process, and have looked at your data and started to set those recidivism reduction goals and identified the target populations you're interested in focusing on by the end of January. That gives you the spring then through April to really do a comprehensive review of the current policies and practices in place and think about ways that you could advance reentry through policy change, program investments, and capacity building generally, and then spend the end of the spring into the summer developing that proposal for implementation funding, which really should be a reflection of that assessment that you've done with your planning team over the spring. And again, just a reminder for everybody, if you have any questions as we go through the presentation, please type them into that Q&A box and we'll get to all of that at the end. So to help you actually hit those goals and timelines, we have developed a technical assistance proposal and the planning and implementation guide to really help walk you and your planning team through this process. And we've set some of these deadlines, as I mentioned, to help you stay on task. So first, establishing that collaborative decision-making body and planning process. And we'll walk through the actual P&I guide, which is kind of your mechanism or tool for ensuring you're on track and actually, submitting something that indicates your completion of each stage. Secondly, doing that data analysis to assess the drivers of recidivism, measure your baseline recidivism rate, and then set your reduction goals. So that also is completed by the end of January, and then that assessment of practices followed up by the completion of writing up recommendations that would go into your implementation proposal. To help you walk through this, we at the National Reentry Resource Center have staff and consultants that are able to provide ongoing support through different mediums to help you complete the guide. So you should, I believe, have been in touch with you all by email, if not phone by this point. So we have the flexibility to develop a tailored technical assistance plan that incorporates phone call, email exchange, on-site visits, bringing in staff experts or outside consultants, providing training, all the things that you need to help your state kind of take the expectations that are set for the planning process and crosswalk them with your state-specific goals, because they will look different from state to state, and make sure that we come up with a technical assistance proposal that reflects what your state's hoping to achieve and what BJA is looking for in terms of having these national models around recidivism reduction in alignment with best practices. We do not see ourselves as auditors. We are really here to help you accomplish your goals, and that is the focus of our technical assistance. Here you can see the technical assistance leads that are assigned to the different states, and so Sheik and I are both on the call, and Laura Zeliger is available to all of us by email or phone. So you can see here the assignments to the different technical assistance leads, and these are the folks that you should be directing your questions to, although, of course, you're welcome to reach out to any of us at any time, and we'll connect you with the right folks. So with that, we're going to pretty quickly move into a discussion about the actual planning implementation guide, which you all should have hopefully received by now, and talk through what the content in the guide, what your expectations are for completing it, and how we can support you in doing that. And so, as I kind of alluded to, the purpose of the planning and implementation guide is really to be a resource to help you achieve these goals that have been set up by BJA in terms of what they want to see when you are positioning yourself for this implementation funding application in the summer. And so it's really a resource to help you and your planning team establish a focused, action-oriented planning process, develop a comprehensive recidivism reduction plan that's really oriented around best practices. It's a tool that can help you kind of communicate your progress with key stakeholders and track it on an ongoing basis. It's also a way to communicate with us about your technical assistance needs and develop a technical assistance plan, and ultimately comply with those expectations BJA has set to become eligible for implementation grant funding in fiscal year 2014 down the road. So it's a dynamic tool. It's supposed to be kind of filled out in an iterative process and in consultation with your technical assistance lead, so we can make sure you're on track and getting all the support that you need to get everything done. So the rest of the presentation is oriented around the 4 sections in the P&I guide. The first section being establishing that planning team, second section data-driven planning, thirdly assessing current practices, and then finally actually coming up with an implementation, sustainability, and evaluation proposal. And so we'll go through for each of those sections kind of the expectations, what the exercise that you have to complete looks like to kind of signal that you've done what's expected, and then all the TA supports that we have made available to you all to help you complete these different expectations. So section 1, establishing a collaborative decision-making body and planning process. The expectations here for you all, and many of you, based on conversations we've had, are well down the road on this, is to kind of establish that representative planning team with a clear vision and mission for that group. And it's possible that you already have an existing entity within your state that does reentry planning that you can kind of leverage and run with. For some of you, you'll be bringing new stakeholders together. So we'll talk a little bit about what a good representative body might look like. And then ultimately, you want to be able to engage key stakeholders and develop that action-oriented planning process, so clarifying at the outset with everyone on the planning team how you're going to achieve the rest of the goals for the planning process moving forward. One key thing to keep in mind, especially as it relates to the planning team composition, is even if you are establishing a new body, there may be other entities out there that are doing similar work that you'll want to coordinate with. And so that's just something to keep in mind as you start to move forward with Section 1. So in terms of the composition, there's flexibility, obviously, to reflect what makes sense for your particular state. But some general principles to be thinking about are shown here. So diversity, making sure you have a wide range of stakeholders. You want to be anticipating who you're going to need on board to implement the proposals you're coming up with. And so the wider the range of stakeholders that are engaged at the outset, the better off you'll be in terms of sustainability and your ability to move forward on those proposals. Decision-making authority is another key element. You want the folks on your planning team to either have a direct line to a decision-maker or have decision-making authority themselves, so that when recommendations are developed, you know you can actually move forward on them. Collaboration and buy-in to the vision and mission. So you want everybody kind of working together towards a shared vision with similar goals. And then lastly, but very importantly, is having clarity of purpose and process. So making sure everybody's on the same page about the purpose of the planning team and how you're going to move forward in terms of accomplishing the goals. And all of that will feed into how effective your planning team will look like. Just as a note, we use the term planning team kind of as a generic term. Task force, reentry council, those are all the same thing. So you can name your team however you'd like, but planning team is kind of our generic team to capture that decision-making body that's driving the work of the planning process. So I want to elaborate a little bit on that last piece, clarity of purpose and process, because this is really going to be a key focus for you all in the next couple months. And just as some tidbits, and these are things, again, that are written out in your planning implementation guide as some considerations for you all. But establishing that clear leadership structure, who's chairing the group, managing the meetings, keeping everybody on task. Again, kind of agreeing upon that vision, mission, and goals at the outset so everybody's clear about expectations. And you might want to go so far as to consider operationalizing some of those things in a written charter. Developing MOUs or letters of agreement that define the expectations for the planning team members can be a good way to ensure that people are engaged. And it also can clarify certain expectations around contingency planning. If somebody drops out of the planning group, will they be replaced by somebody else? So all organizations continue to be represented. Then establishing a set schedule for your meetings with the clear goals and expectations over the course of the planning phase. As we've mentioned a few times, this is a pretty condensed, ambitious process. There's a lot to be done in a short time frame to really position yourself to be ready for that application process in the summer. And so the clearer you can be at the beginning about how you're going to hit those different benchmarks, the better off it'll be in terms of completing everything on time. And then staffing your planning team with folks that can help actually follow up with notes, writing up recommendations that the planning team comes up with is another way to help ensure everything is action-oriented and moving forward. And then lastly, you can just be helpful to develop an organizational chart that kind of specifies what working groups you might have or subcommittees, just clarifying, again, kind of that leadership structure for the planning team, so there's clarity there. So all of that is laid out in the Planning and Implementation Guide under Section 1. And so it gives you some background about what a good planning process might look like. And then exercise 1 within Section 1 is developed to help you actually kind of document what your planning team looks like and what your specific process will be. So tailoring those recommendations to your specific jurisdiction and clarifying what that will look like. And so you'll see within the guide that there is an exercise that consists of 9 questions related to the composition of your planning team, what the meeting schedules will look like, what your vision and mission are, all the things that I've kind of alluded to. So that you have that documented. And the expectation is that that piece of your guide be submitted to your Technical Assistance Lead by Friday, January 31st, 2014. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you until January 31st, 2014. I think it's really important, and one message we really want to make clear is that we're here to help you through this process and through completing the document. We see it as a way for you to record your progress, not as a homework that you just have to do to satisfy some sort of auditing or reporting requirements. So the more we can work with you to make it a process that is tailored to your specific needs, to work with you hand in hand, the better off I think the whole process will work. And that way we know we're supporting you with whatever you might need to hit some of these target due dates. Related to that, we do have technical assistance support available around Section 1. So guidance on the planning team composition. As we mentioned, we've done planning work with Second Chance Act grantees all across the country, including 40 state corrections departments. So we have a lot of experience with different types of jurisdictions about how to develop these teams and facilitate some of these meetings. So happy to provide information on that. Sample mission and vision statements or sample MOUs, LOAs, the charters. We have some of those things as well if you're interested in some stock language you might be able to use for your planning team. We can also help provide some press materials for you to help think about how you can generate enthusiasm about this grant from the media, from state leaders, community stakeholders. A lot of that work at the front end will go a long way in positioning you down the road for sustainability around whatever you might be implementing in terms of policy changes. And with second chance reauthorization just around the corner, like Dr. Dennis mentioned, this is a great time to kind of generate some support from state leaders about the great work they're doing. And even for those states that do not make it to the implementation phase, doing this planning work and this capacity building is really a great accomplishment in and of itself and something you should be touting to get more people engaged. And then lastly, and this applies really to all the sections, we're available to provide objective feedback and recommendations as you move forward and answer any kind of ad hoc questions you might have as you move forward. So with that, we're going to move on to Section 2 of the guide, which is, once you put your planning team together, develop your process, actually starting to look at the data and figure out where your focus will be. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Mike Eisenberg from the Justice Center, who is a research manager and data guru. And so he will be talking through some of those expectations and the supports we have around data collection.
Hello, everybody. I am Mike Eisenberg. I'm research manager in our Austin, Texas office, which is where our research group is located. I think they selected Texas so that we could use our unspoken motto that says, if Texas can do it, anybody can. So that we're kind of the baseline for expectations here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Section 2, using a data-driven approach for recidivism reduction, goal setting, and planning. And I sort of want to use us as an example, Texas as an example of some of what we're looking for in these four bullets here. The first expectation is define and measure the statewide recidivism rate. And in Texas, we actually have a statutory requirement that we calculate 1, 2, and 3-year recidivism measures every 2 years when our legislature meets. And our definition is return to prison for a new conviction or technical violation, which seems to be one of the more common measures that state correction departments are utilizing. So I'm thinking that's not going to be a big lift for a lot of the states to be able to do that. Sometimes it's not as easy as you think. We worked in Vermont. I know we got some Vermont people there. And Vermont is a unified system of jail and prison. And defining exactly who's a prisoner coming back to prison for a new offense and technical violation sometimes gets a little squishy, as we found in our work there. But in general, that measure is fairly easy to calculate and capture. And so that's what we're going to hope that you can provide us with your definition of recidivism and how you measure it. Secondly is to understand the drivers of recidivism. And we've been through all the drivers here in the state of Texas. I'm kind of an old guy, so I've seen it all. And we had serious prison overcrowding in the 80s. And so our first approach to addressing that was to be more liberal with our parole rates and let property and low-level offenders released. And we got up to about an 80% parole approval rate. And unfortunately, that made it even worse, as letting a lot of property offenders go will drive up your recidivism rates. And so we added a lot of prison capacity to address that. And that kind of also exacerbated our problem, in that gave parole officers freedom to bring back a lot of technical violators they had been constrained because of our prison capacity. So the next step in the direction was we developed a lot of what we call intermediate sanction facilities, which were short-term incarceration facilities for mostly technical violators, and that helped to reduce our return to prison. Some offenders got the message by this short-term incarceration and reduced their violating patterns. And then we introduced a very large substance abuse treatment program of inpatient, outpatient facilities. And so our recidivism rate, which approached 50% in the late 80s, is currently at about 24% return to prison within 3 years. So it shows we can reduce it. That's been about a 30-year process, but we've been through all the ups and downs you can go through in addressing this issue. Dr. Dennis mentioned that 50% rate is kind of ludicrous in a short-term period, but and then we also get to the point where we've gone from 50% to 24%, and that's a lot easier to go from there, from 50 to 24, than from 24 to even 15. So at some point, your ability to reduce recidivism diminishes over time, but it still can be done. So the next step will be identify an appropriate target population. Who are your high recidivism offenders? What do they look like? What practices might help to reduce their recidivism? And then, based on all this information, you'll be asked to set recidivism reduction goals, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the Section 2 exercise is once you do, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with your statewide recidivism rate and know how that breaks down as to by risk level, by offense level, by age, by geographic areas. So the exercise essentially asks you to identify what the drivers are by examining all those various variables that comprise the recidivism rate. I think a lot of people look at the recidivism rate by risk level, by new offense and technical violations, and by demographic variables. And I think that's pretty much what the exercise is asking you to do. And after doing that, through that exercise, I think it will help identify a target population that you want to set your program for and help in setting recidivism reduction goals. There is no national standard. Nobody set a measure for what is recidivism. There's a wide variety of measures that are used, including arrest, conviction, and return to incarceration. As I said, I think a lot of places are using return to incarceration as their recidivism measure. Although here in Texas we use both a return to incarceration and arrest. And those are both easily accessed by our Department of Corrections and by our Department of Public Safety, which receives all arrests from local law enforcement. Conviction data in Texas is kind of difficult to access as it's required to be reported to our Department of Public Safety, but a lot of judicial districts fail to completely and accurately report that information, so we don't use conviction data very much. I know in Vermont they have excellent conviction data. Then we want to make sure everybody's using a standard follow-up period. That uniform tracking is critical to doing an accurate recidivism rate. Sometimes the length of time that you can follow a group is dictated by, to some extent, the legislature wanting results immediately and you not having adequate time to follow up a group that you've targeted. But we are looking at 1-, 2-, and 3-year follow-ups, knowing that the 1 year will be lower, all things being equal, the 1 year will be lower than a 3 year just because the time at risk is less. So I think that's a very important thing for everybody to keep in mind, and I know most places do, but I've seen program evaluations where their program is really good because they only track them for like 3 days. So the longer you follow a group, the greater opportunity for recidivism to occur. And as I already talked about, being able to disaggregate your population by risk level can give you important clues on what populations are necessary to address. And if you have longitudinal data, that will really help identify sources of your recidivism. And I know that more and more states are utilizing various risk instruments, from the LSI to the RAS to Wisconsin, which we still use here. And not sure how common longitudinal data is available, but the longer you have longitudinal data by risk, better able, I think, you'll be able to target your populations. Similarly, revocation type is an important issue in a lot of states. We had very high technical revocation rates. I'd say half of our returning population was for supervision violations, and with our intermediate sanction facilities, where we can do short-term sanctions for violators, we've been able to drive that down significantly. And again, that's going to vary based on your intermediate sanction resources or your treatment resources. But I think it would be important to understand the distinction between your returning population, whether it's for new offense or for technical violations. It's always it's a little bit controversial in a lot of the states we've been in as to what really constitutes a technical violation. As I work with a lot of probation departments, and they'll identify somebody as a technical violator who may also have a new offense charge behind that technical violation, and so they're recording it as a technical when it may really be a new crime if you allow enough time to process. So that's always a difficult issue to ascertain as to what a technical violation is, and is it really a significant contributor to the returning population. So again, as Phoebe has said, we'll be able to offer a lot of support for anybody needing assistance in filling out this section, both on the phone or actually in person. And again, I'd be glad to address any questions that come up later on. And now I'm going to turn it back to Phoebe. I know how to do that.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So, Section 2 is data intensive, and there's a lot of nuance to it, obviously, as kind of alluded to by Mike's presentation. And so we want to make sure that we're available to work with you across your varying, levels of data access, familiarity with your data, points of interest in terms of how you're breaking down the data. And so we can do that, by either looking at your data directly, talking with you about data that you've already interpreted, and helping you think about how to focus in on key areas. I just want to reiterate that the sooner you kind of let us know that the data piece and the expectations in Section 2 are going to be, complicated or difficult to complete, let us know that sooner rather than later, so we can kind of develop a TA strategy to work with you around the data piece and provide that guidance. Another thing related to data, and the reason that we're kind of giving you this full overview of the guide up front is that, these things are really all interrelated. So looking backwards to Section 1, it's really important that you have folks on your planning team that are familiar and with the data in your state and can help you do some of that analysis. So, be thoughtful now at the outset about who you're going to need on your team to be able to kind of complete the expectations in Section 2. And it very well may be data of folks from a number of different agencies to kind of get that full picture of recidivism in your state. Looking forward to Section 3, one of the key goals of Section 2 and the reason to look at these specific drivers of recidivism is to help you be a little bit more focused in your planning work when you think about how you want to spend that proposed, $1 to $3 million that you'll be kind of developing your recommendations around. As everybody knows, huge chunk of money, but you can't serve everybody with $3 million, nor do you want to, right? We want to be targeted in how we spend these resources to get the biggest kind of recidivism bang for our buck. And so Section 3 is designed to help you assess your current practices, but the more targeted you can be in thinking about which part of the population you want to focus on or what part of the system you want to focus on, whether it's, parole revocations, probation revocations, and the sentence folks. Who are the drivers? Where are they returning to? That'll make your work in Section 3 more targeted, more focused, and ultimately more easy to complete, and then taking you on to Section 4 when you actually write that proposal. So with that, going into Section 3, this is basically now assessing all the kind of current policies and practices you have going on that impact recidivism and thinking about the barriers and gaps that you might want to address in your proposal. And so we talk about barriers being kind of mainly non-resource related or capacity related issues. So these are things like policies and procedures that can really hinder the reentry process that aren't necessarily major funding needs. So how do you tailor your supervision strategies? How are you releasing people, promoting in reach? And when we get to Section 4, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those different things. But what are some policy barriers in place? And also, what are some funding gaps where, lacking services, you need to build up your capacity with staff training and things like that. So it's really looking at both of those types of issues. And then the assessment that you're doing is focused on 3 key areas, and these are straight out of the solicitation that you all applied for to get this planning grant. So the first is using risk and needs assessments, kind of drive program and service placements, inform release decisions, setting supervision conditions, and informing responses to behavior. So really kind of everything. It's all about risk and needs assessment-driven case planning. Secondly, the second big bucket is around programming and intervention. So are we actually providing the interventions and programs that change criminal behavior and are grounded in research that shows that they lead to reductions in recidivism? In addition to that, not only are we investing in programs and interventions, but we're actually paying attention to the quality of the delivery of those services. And so there's also an assessment piece around, do we have quality assurance measures? Are we making sure that we use our quality assurance processes to improve our programming and intervention? So it's not just about taking a curriculum off the shelf and starting to apply it somewhere. It's about actually being thoughtful about how we implement it, training people effectively, and delivering the curriculum in the way that will actually impact recidivism and change offender behavior. And then the third bucket, where you'll be doing some of this assessment, is around supervision. And so we know that a huge driver of recidivism is tied to the way that we respond to behaviors, both positive and negative, in the community. And so how do we implement effective supervision strategies that are attentive to risk and needs, that encourage compliance with conditions of release, and ultimately help drive down both revocations and new offenses by addressing offender behavior in a manner that is, the term often is just uncertain, but in a manner that actually creates incentives for people to follow the conditions of their release. So those are the 3 major buckets that your analysis is really going to be focused on. And again, straight out of the solicitation. The reason those were in the solicitation as the areas of focus is because of kind of the years of research in the field and what we've seen in states and other jurisdictions across the country implementing as effective ways to reduce recidivism. So the exercise that you're expected to do for this is actually completing these checklists under the 3 different topics I just laid out. And so in doing that, you're going to start to identify the different ways that your state can advance recidivism reduction by focusing in on the key areas where you see some barriers and gaps currently. So there are 3 checklists, 45 total questions that you'll be assessing for your system with kind of this target deadline of the end of April 25th. And as you go through these checklists, what you're going to try to be doing with the planning team, it's really important that this is done as a cohesive group. It's not easy to fill out a single checklist for the group of 15 people on the table, but those debates and arguments and disagreements about what you're doing well or not doing is what's ultimately going to inform a strong implementation proposal, as opposed to have 1 or 2 siloed people kind of coming up with ideas on their own, but not having that discussion and buy-in from the broader planning team. So really important that is kind of a comprehensive process with the whole planning team. And you're going to try to kind of develop a baseline understanding of your current system. So what is the status of implementation for these 45 different checklist items that are listed out? What are we doing well? Where do we have a long way to go? And then get kind of consensus on the gaps and the barriers that exist within that existing system. What do we really need to bolster to start to impact our recidivism rates? And then thirdly, you're going to take that analysis and start to come up with a priority list of where are the areas we really need to focus when we write our recommendation, our proposal for implementation funding to have the biggest impact on recidivism. And again, just to reiterate this point, you might see this assessment focus on a particular population that you know is a major driver of recidivism. When I'm saying target population, I'm not talking, only 100 people who are going through a program, but a large, a focused chunk of your population, whether it is their supervision status, probation, parole, or people coming out to the major cities or urban areas that are drivers of recidivism. So large target populations, but at least focus enough that when you ask questions about community supervision strategies and all of that, you're clear about who you're talking about and what agencies are affected by these recommendations you're making. So here's actually a picture of what these checklists look like in the Planning and Implementation Guide. And so this is an example from there's 3 checklists. So the first checklist, as I mentioned, is about using risk and needs assessments to drive kind of your resource allocation decisions and your individual case responses. And so this is the first item you'll see, using a criminogenic risk and needs assessment tool, which is validated in norms, to inform your case management decisions. So it's a pretty loaded question, and all of these are. And in some ways that's intentional, to get people talking about what are we doing well, what aren't we doing well. And the reason that your implementation status will probably be a little bit nuanced. We're doing some pieces of this, but some pieces are missing. And so focus less on knowing exactly what your implementation status is, but more thoughtful about why are we coming to that decision, and what are the barriers and gaps that we see in the current way of doing things that we want to address in our implementation proposal. And you'll see along the way for some of these checklist items, not all of them, we request where it's available some examples of the things that we're asking about. So, for example, if you're asking for a copy of the validation study if available, this is really a way to help us as we work with you through this assessment process to better understand how your system works and help you identify areas for advancement. So the next 2 checklist examples here are from the second and third buckets. So the second bucket being, again, establishing programs and practices that are shown to reduce recidivism and implementing them with fidelity. And so another example here, this is about ensuring that the prison community-based programs that you're investing in are designed to address criminogenic needs and incorporate evidence-based treatment models. So once again, kind of loaded, there's a lot to this, and you'll find on a lot of the checklists, but it helps you kind of stay focused on the key areas of interest and the key best practices that we've seen in the research on how to reduce recidivism. So the same kind of process, implementation status, an explanation of that status, and then identifying those gaps and barriers. And then thirdly, you have a series of checklists related to community supervision policies and practices. So how can we help you with this? 45 checklist items, very loaded, a lot of discussion involved. And, it's very important that the discussion is something that is then translated into written recommendations that go into your proposal for implementation funding. And so given that, we want to work with you to help facilitate some of those discussions to the extent that you feel that would be a helpful support. We will be providing training webinars for each of those three bucket areas, and it's intended to give some helpful context to your planning team, about why those items are in the checklist, the research behind them, and some examples from other jurisdictions about, how those things have been implemented well. So it gives you a little bit of context before your planning team kind of gets into the weeds of figuring out, are we doing this, aren't we doing that? I don't even know what that means. In addition to those training webinars, we're available to come on site and provide kind of booster trainings or more tailored trainings around some of the evidence-based practices in the checklist by either our expert in-house staff or consultants that we have. And so you can come on site, provide some of that additional training to your planning team. And you're welcome, when we do these on-site visits, to broaden the people that benefit from any of those trainings. Thirdly, we can help actually facilitate kind of this assessment process. And again, this is all options of TA that are out there for you. So we're kind of presenting a menu, and we expect to kind of have conversations one-on-one with all of you about what your specific needs are and what the best supports would be. But the on-site facilitation would be, actually going through the checklist items and helping you think about where some of the gaps in your system are and some strategies for addressing those gaps. And then lastly, as with everything, we have information we can share, publications on best practices, examples from other jurisdictions, and other supplemental training resources. That's section 3, and it's really the heaviest lift in some ways of your process, because it's really where you do that deep dive and figure out what areas you're going to want to address in your implementation proposal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shanique to take on the last section and walk through how you're going to take that assessment and translate it into a proposal for implementation funding.
Thank you, Phoebe. So for section 4, we will review the expectations, exercises, and available TA support for the implementation, sustainability, and evaluation planning process. Now for this section of the P&I guide, we cover the implementation proposal that your agency will submit to BJA. It is the summation of the activities covered in sections 1, 2, and 3. Your team should incorporate these sections to develop a comprehensive statewide recidivism reduction implementation proposal. The components that are covered in section 4 include systemic capacity building, which refers to the incorporation of policy changes and strategies for reducing barriers to reentry that promote implementation of evidence-based practices. Expanding evidence-based interventions and programming. You want to make sure that your interventions and programming are supported by research and empirical evidence. Next, we cover sustainability planning, which is the implementation of systemic policy changes requiring minimal funding support. And lastly, we cover evaluation planning, which is tracking the progress of meeting recidivism reduction goals and effectiveness of interventions. Now, the first topic area we will delve into is systemic capacity building. It is imperative that the planning team maintains the goal of taking a statewide approach to reduce recidivism. This requires that the team think beyond the scope of implementing a few short-term programming changes. We provided examples of systems changes that can build a state's capacity for supporting effective reentry in the long term. Now, the first example is information sharing. Consider enhancing information sharing across different departments and with other key reentry partners. Agencies working with the same population should be able to share this information on the individuals they work with, especially as it relates to the continuity of care and aftercare services provided by your community partners. Along the same thread as information sharing, data collection is a critical element with system-wide impact. Enhance data collection capacity to ensure that agencies can monitor recidivism trends over time, understand the drivers of recidivism, and are able to evaluate the impact of new policies and programmatic interventions on recidivism outcomes. Next, modify how sanctions and incentives are used by community supervision agencies. They should be employed in a swift and certain manner and proportionate to the seriousness of the violations and criminogenic risk levels. As mentioned earlier, the risk assessment that you use is very important. Invest in validating your scanning and risk assessment tools and case management software. Make sure you have case management software to ensure that individuals' case plans reflect their risk level and specific needs, or consider revalidating your own assessment. Again, adjust program enrollment criteria to promote R&R principles and determine which individuals to prioritize for treatment and programming. We know with R&R principles, you want to focus on the moderate and high-risk individuals. Promote quality assurance to ensure programming and other interventions are implemented with fidelity. Another suggestion is reduce barriers to prison in-reach by community providers, by family members, and supervision officers. This in-reach is important to support stronger transition planning and release preparation for the individual returning to the community. Lastly, consider enhancing staff buy-in to reentry efforts to improve communication, performance expectations, oversight, and accountability. You are definitely not limited to these methods, but these examples serve as a good starting point for your planning team to consider in implementing a statewide impact. Next, when implementing programming, the planning team should ensure that the practice is evidence-based, supported by research, and effectively addresses individuals' communogenic needs. The most effective programs are behavioral in nature and focus on present circumstances, needs, and risk factors linked to the behavior of the person who committed the crime. These interventions are action-oriented rather than talk-oriented or didactic lectures and are designed to teach pro-social skills. Cognitive behavioral programs help people who have committed crimes identify how thinking patterns influence feelings, which influences actions. They include structured social learning programs where new skills, behaviors, and attitudes are consistently reinforced. Now, cognitive behavioral programs are not a cure-all and should be more than just a curriculum. The program should also target attitudes, values, and beliefs. Choice of peers, whether the individual abuses substances and expresses anger, and their interactions with family. Reinforcing cognitive behavioral skill building can occur through routine interactions, not just programming. New models are being developed for how community supervision officers can reinforce these skills during their face-to-face interactions with their probationers or parolees. Lastly, it's also important that investments are made in staff skills that promote responsivity. An example is training staff on motivational interviewing techniques, which can help engage individuals and strengthen their intrinsic motivation for change. A critical process of the planning is to develop a strategy and ideas on how to sustain your statewide efforts beyond the life of the grant. So again, consider systemic policy changes that do not require significant funding support or are more of a change in how the agency does business. There are a number of factors to consider when thinking about sustainability. The first one includes unified vision and mission. Now, Phoebe alluded to this earlier in section 1. The planning team should agree upon a unified vision and mission, and from that, should develop business rules to institutionalize procedures and policies to withstand any political environment or administration. So you want to make sure that this vision and mission can withstand any changes that may occur within your state. Stakeholder buy-in and investment. Since the statewide recidivism reduction planning grant is designed to have a broad statewide impact, the planning team, as an active body guiding the direction of this planning process, should work closely to garner written and verbal buy-in and investment from the Office of the Governor and other executive departments that may have parallel criminal justice initiatives and or structures. So you want to make sure that your planning process and your proposal is in line with what is currently moving forward within your state. Also, you should engage agencies at the front end of the criminal justice process, such as the judiciary, prosecutors, and district attorneys, on an ongoing basis throughout the planning and implementation processes. Effective communication strategy and protocols. Your plan should include well-developed standard communication protocols designed for specific audiences and partners for specific audiences. The planning team should develop strategies that highlight the receipt of the word to broad audiences and messaging around the goals of the reentry planning team. Effective communication has the potential to influence the engagement and further investment of stakeholders, advancing the development of the implementation plan, and also enhance the sustainability of the overall effort. In developing this communications plan, considerations should include establishing specific messages for your group, for your target audience group, and coordinating these strategies with other existing initiatives. Also, across your planning team and the partners involved in the proposal, you want to make sure that you have a way to share information, such as a web-based driver or folders. Finally, you want to make sure to consider institutionalizing a continual review and ongoing quality assurance process. Specifically, the planning team should revisit and review the plan after the grant period ends to make sure the outlined strategy is on course and continues to meet the identified goals and benchmarks. To promote continuity, a stable infrastructure, and partner accountability, planning team members' roles should be clearly articulated through those MOUs or letters of support. And these agreements should be revisited on an annual basis. So you may need to modify what is outlined in those MOUs or LOAs that you initially proposed. Accordingly, since the planning process seeks to recalibrate the traditional practice and operations, the planning team should extensively and continually identify any challenges that may affect the implementation of the strategy. So once you identify these challenges, maybe in consultation with evaluators, a TA provider, or outside experts, you should develop ways to implement recommendations to address these challenges. This sustainability plan also needs to develop mechanisms to support ongoing quality assurance. Some ways to achieve this goal are to outline performance-based measures for partners at the outset within those letters of support. Require ongoing education and training of partners and their staff members. Require that continual assessment and evaluation of the strategy and those partners. In building a sustainable plan of change that differs from current practice and policies, it's imperative that the planning team and other engaged stakeholders are amenable to allowing the data to drive the process. And you want to pay attention to what Mike Eisenberg listed out in Section 2. Therefore, it is important to provide opportunities to reconsider those goals and measures of your MOUs and allow for modification or elimination of ineffective programs, services, and policies. The final component of Section 4 that we cover is the evaluation planning process. Now, evaluations help to promote sustainability by providing agencies with information on the effectiveness of their intervention, and these results can translate to securing future funding. Now, not all investments made through this SRR program should be evaluated in the same way. The evaluation design for a specific program will likely look different than the evaluation design for a policy that has agency-wide implications. You are encouraged by BJA to contract with a consultant, university, research institute, or the like to assist with the design and completion of the evaluation. To develop a successful evaluation plan, your team must first understand what is being evaluated. The evaluation should not consist only of a one-point-in-time outcome evaluation, but should be complemented with a process evaluation to continually assess progress and document changes. In doing so, you can adjust as needed and identify specific elements required for successful implementation. The process evaluation should look at a number of issues, including, is the program utilizing a design that has previously demonstrated an ability to reduce recidivism? Is the program being implemented as designed? Is staff training and experience adequate to deliver the program? Are risk needs assessed and services delivered based on these identified risk needs? Is the dosage of the treatment adequate enough to affect the desired change? And is the delivery of these services consistent over time? Once the process evaluation is complete, it is then appropriate to evaluate the impact of policy changes on key outcome measures, including recidivism. The planning team should also consider how statewide recidivism rates will be tracked over time to assess progress toward meeting reduction goals. The team should revisit the data analysis conducted to complete Section 2 at regular intervals to help inform corrections administrators and policymakers about the drivers of recidivism within the state and ensure policies and interventions are effectively targeting those drivers. So to assist with your data collection efforts in your population, you may want to determine a common statewide identifier that can be used across all systems. I know some systems have like a statewide bureau identifier number that they use for people who enter the justice system. You also want to assess data management and storage methods. How are data stored across these departments that will be involved in the process? And can these systems interface? If they're unable to interface, you want to make sure to create these capabilities of the multiple departments and organizational data systems. And I just want to reiterate that these are things that you don't have to move forward throughout this process, but you want to create a plan of how you will handle these aspects. So the exercise for Section 4 centers on the development of action plans for the planning components that we just discussed. So building systemic capacity, investment in evidence-based approaches, program evaluation, and program sustainability. So for the building systemic capacity section, you will be asked to enter recommendations made by the planning team for policy changes or investments to build system-wide capacity. You will also need to indicate which policy and performance expectations are supported by these recommendations, and also list recommendations for actual interventions or programs, and indicate the target population for each. In regards to sustainability planning, we want you to be creative and critically consider ways to sustain your proposal and planning team beyond the life of the grant. So some of the questions ask you to identify challenges that you may face, develop strategies to include stakeholders and to garner political support, and schedule a process for conducting ongoing reviews. Lastly, we have additional questions related to the evaluation plan, such as identifying the treatment and comparison groups in your study, defining successful completion and recidivism, and data collection methods. The deadline for these exercises is listed as Friday, June 27th, 2014. Some of the available support that we can provide for Section 4 includes objective feedback on your proposal, again, information sharing, so providing resources and research articles and reports related to interventions in recidivism reduction and reentry efforts in other states and jurisdictions, expert consultations on your strategy and strategic planning efforts, and lastly, assistance with developing the evaluation and sustainability plan. So here's a quick recap of the P&I Guide deadlines. Section 1, establishing a collaborative decision-making body and planning process, January 31st, 2014. Section 2, due also January 31st, 2014. We're focused on taking a data-driven approach to recidivism reduction goal setting and planning. Section 3, due April 25th, 2014. Assessing current recidivism reduction policies and implementation gaps and barriers. And Section 4, developing that implementation proposal due June 27th, 2014. And these exercises should have you well prepared for submitting a comprehensive proposal to BJA. So remember that these have been set to help ensure you complete the necessary steps to be ready to apply. And if you find yourself struggling to meet any of these due dates or deadlines, or have any questions about the guide or anything else, please be sure to reach out to your TA provider. You can find your TA provider again listed on this slide. Now with that, we will go ahead and answer any questions. Please continue to enter your questions in that Q&A panel box you see off to the side. We'll get to as many as we can within this limited time frame. Thank you.
This is Phoebe again. I just want to kind of wrap up and just reiterate kind of the interconnectedness of all four sections of the guide. And so, while you're working on one part of the guide, you're very likely going to be informing through that work what goes in the later parts of the guide as well. And I think that really rings true for sections 3 and 4. As you conduct that analysis of the gaps and barriers that you hope to address or focus on in your proposal, you can be recording that information in section 4, where it asks you to list out the recommendations for policy changes, evidence-based practices that you want to invest in, so that you're kind of doing both the analysis and the recommendation proposal simultaneously. And so we do have that staggered approach, but there will be some overlap. We do not have any questions listed in our QA panel, but we do encourage you to keep entering them as you go. We can also let you off early, which I know everybody always appreciates. I do want to note also that we have, again, recorded the webinar, so for folks who want to share any of this information with the broader planning team that you're going to be bringing together, you can use that link to provide this information with them as well. One of the key things that we're going to want to do with all of you moving forward is set up these one-on-one calls or even on-site visits to talk about how we can tailor our TA approach given kind of the menu of services that we have available to make sure that you move forward. And so we'll make sure that we're in touch with you to set up some of those one-on-one calls right away. Okay. So I'm just looking here at the Q&A, and we have a couple of things popping in. So there's one question around best practices and testing instruments and recommendations on that. I'm not, and this is from one again, I think our Spanish group, I don't know if, Sean, if we're able to unmute, but to get clarification on exactly what the information you're looking for, if it's around validating or testing risk assessment instruments. And if so, I think Mike actually might be best positioned to answer any kind of questions about that.
Can we determine if Will can elaborate on his question? Can he unmute?
I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, Mike. This is Sean. They would need to elaborate through the Q&A panel below because most of the attendees are listening over the speakers on the computer.
I see.
Okay, so if you want to go ahead and type in a little elaboration on that particular question, and we can jump to another one that has come in the meantime and then go back to that, that would be really helpful. We do have a question about whether or not implementation funding can focus on a specific geographic region, a judicial district, for instance, or whether or not it really has to be a statewide target population. The way that we have talked about the definition of statewide through this grant is really about the impact on recidivism. So are you implementing broad enough policy changes or hitting a significant, a large enough size of your population that's coming out to impact that statewide rate? And the key to this, obviously, is kind of tempering our expectations for how much of an impact you can have on your statewide rate. So when you go through section, short answer is yes, you can, if you can justify that with your data that a particular district or geographic region is a significant enough contributor to your statewide recidivism rate that having a large impact there would actually affect your statewide rate. So that's kind of the standard by which BGA has defined that statewide measure. And Section 2, when you go through that part of the guide where you're kind of identifying your target population and looking at your recidivism numbers, will actually ask you to look at a set recidivism reduction goal both for your target population defined and the statewide rate, and kind of demonstrate how those two are interconnected. And so that's definitely something that we can kind of talk about further, one-on-one about how to make that work and what those numbers might look like. So long story short, yes, you can focus on a specific jurisdiction if you can demonstrate it's a large enough population that will impact that statewide rate. So Mike, we have some more elaboration there on that question we had. Interest in hearing more about the intermediate sanction resources that were used in Texas.
Okay. In the late 80s, early 90s, the state decided to build a number of short-term lockup facilities for violators, and used primarily by parole officers to deal with mostly supervision violators. And those involved a modification of supervision conditions to lock up for up to 90 days in a facility. There'd be the parole board member actually would have to modify his supervision, and then they would usually start 30 days, and if continued, 60 days, 90 days, and eventually, if necessary, revocation back to prison. They're all state-run and operated by the Department of Corrections, and it's been, it's a costly way of doing things, but I think it's less costly than having to incarcerate and build additional facilities in the state prison system for those lockups. And our technical violators returned to prison. We're spending a year, 2 years incarcerated, and we had a significant portion of the population that did respond to these 30, 60, 90-day lockups. And I think probably on the Texas Department of Criminal Justice website, I think there's a section in their publications that describes the intermediate sanction facilities, their use, operational procedures, things like that. So if you need more information, you can contact me at misenberg@csg.org.
Great. Thanks, Mike. There's also kind of a follow-up question, if you can field too, about the testing instruments. Testing instruments in regards to some of the proprietary or other off-the-shelf tools that are widely used, like the LSIR. Any recommendations around some of the testing part, I'm assuming in relation to validation and reliability?
I think most of the instruments out there are fairly reliable, explain about the same amount of variance in recidivism, LSIR. And, there's a question of how much information do you need. The LSIR is 54 questions. Some places where you have huge caseloads, 200 offenders, you're not be able to use all that information. There's a variety of shorter instruments that actually the LSI has the LSI-V, which is a kind of a screening for risk that can disaggregate your population according to risk of reoffending. And if that's the main goal, if you don't have anything already, you may want to start with a risk screen like the LSI-V or the Wisconsin or the ORAS, which is a public domain instrument from Ohio. Ed Latesses developed that. It's actually designed to be a comprehensive system-wide screening, assessment, and planning tool that would start ideally in the courts at sentencing and go through probation, prison incarceration, and parole release. And it's being implemented in Ohio, and a number of the states are either in the process of implementing or looking at it. We're looking at it here in Texas. But I say in general that most of the instruments, if we're just talking about differentiating the population into risk of reoffending, into low, medium, and high, or those categories, they'll do an equally good job and really don't have to involve a large number of variables. The most common variables in any of the risk prediction instruments are age of first arrest, current age, number of arrests over lifetime, offense type, if you can get employment status, drug usage sometimes is not a good predictor. It depends on how well it's evaluated, I think, to some extent. And there are a number of public domain drug screens that will identify basically if this person has a drug issue related to their offending behavior that are out there. TCU drug dependency scale is out there. There's quite a number of them. And again, if you want to discuss that, give me a call or give me an email. We can go from there.
Thanks, Mike. So we've got a number of questions that have come in related to kind of the nuances of assessment. Can we assess for things other than just, a blanket kind of recidivism measure, but, likelihood of violating terms and condition, also some questions related to cultural competency. I think one of the key things that we will be doing that will help answer some of these questions is the training webinar when we get closer towards the timelines for doing the assessments around the checklist, particularly checklist 1, which is around case planning, assessment-driven case planning, and we can answer a lot of those questions through those training mechanisms. Short-term, though, we can also answer a lot of questions just one-on-one through email. And again, still have the emails up on the screen, so reach out to your lead point of contact, and we can funnel a lot of these questions through Mike as well to make sure we answer some of the content stuff that we might not get to. There was one question related to program management. So yes, you will be assigned a program manager at BGA as the standard. In terms of the timeline, we are working closely with BGA, and they are aware, obviously, of how we're kind of condensing this planning process to account for the timelines for submitting an implementation proposal. And so some sensitivity around how that might affect the need to expedite things like getting budgets approved and getting the grants cleared and all of that. Dr. Dennis, I don't know if you're still on the line, if you want to mention anything about kind of the grant management process or things grantees should be aware of.
Well, I think that if the budget has not been cleared yet, then they should work with their BJA program policy advisor to find out if there are any issues that haven't been addressed, because we anticipate that those budgets should all be cleared certainly by the end of November, so you can draw down the money. Then the time frames that everybody's talked about a little bit are really play into the fact that for the major implementation awards, we're talking about FY14 money, and we have to have all of that money awarded by next September of 14, the end of the federal fiscal year. But for the current 13 grants, the planning grants, if those budgets haven't been cleared, then you need to talk with your BJA program policy program person about that. And they know that this is a priority for us, for all of the agencies, so they'll work with you to make sure that any questions can be answered quickly.
Great, thank you. So winding down on time here, so a few kind of housekeeping related questions. The P&I guide link is to a PDF, so we do have a Word version that you can more easily modify and fill out that we can send you by email. So if you don't have a copy of that, just follow up. I'll send an email to all the contacts that we have with that, but you can also follow up with us directly to make sure you get access to that information. One other thing that, is helpful from our perspective is any materials, including your program narratives or some of those attachments that come with the program narratives that you submitted for your proposal that you think are relevant would be helpful for a TA person to know about before we start conversations about your TA goals. You're welcome to send those in as well. That's helpful from our perspective. So, and lastly, in terms of any other content questions, we'll keep tabs of the ones that were submitted that we didn't get through today and try to reach out to you directly one-on-one. But in general, any content-related questions, please don't hesitate to just reach out to us directly and ask them. That's why we're here. Our whole goal with this process is to make sure that you have the support you need to finish this process, to get through this planning process and develop a strong implementation proposal. And so we hope to kind of work with you directly throughout, from now until you complete that process and answer any questions you might have. So with that, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you everyone so much for participating. Thank you Dr. Dennis, Mike, and Shanique as well for your contributions for the presentation. We greatly appreciate it. After you exit the webinar, a brief survey will appear on the screen. And by answering the questions in that survey, you'll be helping the Resource Center improve on the services that we offer. So we greatly appreciate if you would just take a few minutes to complete that survey. As mentioned, we will email a link to the recording of the presentation as well as a link to the PDF of the PowerPoint slides used in the presentation no later than early next week. And I will also make sure everybody gets a copy of the Planning and Implementation Guide, both the Word version and PDF version. These links will also be available on the National Reentry Resource Center website, which is csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. So you're welcome to go there and also look at other materials that are available. Thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to working with you all over the coming year. Thank you.